thought we were done, didn't you?
It's not over. Not yet.
This is kind of part 2 of Howl's bedroom.
The lid. The lid. The lid. The lid.
Since before I even made anything in the tin, I had planned to make the outer lid Sophie's hat shop. I thought it would be really cool to make the entire tin a full Howl's Moving Castle piece. So here we are. It definitely has nothing to do with me being torn between wanting to make Howl's bedroom and Sophie's hat shop.
Well, if you insist.
So of course, as always, we're starting with a painting. After painting Howl's bedroom, honestly, I went into this one like, this is gonna be simple. It's really not, but comparatively, yeah, this one was pretty simple. I really love all of the colors going on in this scene. The whole town that they designed is just so charming. All the bright, vibrant colors are really my thing. I really love all the colors in Howl's Moving Castle generally, but the colors of the houses in this little city are just so beautiful and lovely together. I always forget to show what kind of paint I use because I pretty much use the same paint all the time, but I always get questions about it. So for anyone wondering, I use the cheapest acrylic craft paint that I can get my hands on. It's honestly not great, but you don't need to have the finest quality paint or materials to make something really cool. I think that it's a little bit different with like watercolor and other paints like that, but for me, it doesn't really matter that much. If you get the cheaper paint, you can still paint something pretty nice with it. I always say this, but doing a painting of the material that you are going to create really does help later on in visualizing all of the details, being able to build it better and more easily in miniature. So here is our painting of Sophie's hat shop. Now that we have our painting done, it's time to start our build.
Wait a second, you're all gonna eat while I do all the work?
So the base of this is obviously the lid of the cookie tin that I built Howl's bedroom in. However, I am going to build most of this off the lid before I attach it because it makes creating the details a lot easier. So I cut a shape of paperboard that was the same size as the lid, drew on where everything was going to go to get an idea of what size and scale everything needed to be in relation to each other. Then I cut out the places where the windows and the door frame will be, as they do recede into the building. I'm attaching long strips of paperboard to the back of those to make the little inset alcoves. Then starting to work on some details of the facade of the building. The bottom has a concrete base that I'm making 3-dimensional from craft foam. I know I say this in like every single video.
What? Not again.
I decide materials based on the thickness of them. Since the concrete sticks out the most, we're using it for that. The roof juts out from the rest of the building, so I am creating a separate piece for that so that it can protrude from the facade of the building. I'm cutting out the top windows from that as well, and then using some strips of paperboard around that top part of the roof to create the amount of depth that I want it to come out from the bottom main shop. In all of the close-ups of the building in the movie, it is relatively weathered. To start working on the facade of the shop, I am going to create some weathering by going in with a dull X-Acto knife, really carefully prying off the top layer of paperboard from certain areas to make it look like some kind of disintegrating stucco. Then I painted the outside of the shop that green color. And I'm going into those areas that I cut out with some white and just kind of giving them the depth that they have in the movie. I'm painting in some little shadows at the top to really sell a little bit more of the dimensional effect. Just like in the Howl's bedroom miniature, I am making a lot of things in 2.5D so that it doesn't stick out too much and we don't have too big and bulky of a project since it's going on the lid. I wanted to create a little bit of a rougher angled edge coming from the craft foam, so I just went in again with my dull craft knife and angled off that edge. I also went in and hacked away at some of the bottom foam to make the stone a little bit more rough and damaged. Weathering. I painted that to look as much like the concrete as I could with some different tones and highlights and shadows. Then I started creating the frames around the windows and the door frame. I wanted to weather the frames just a little bit so that it matches the rest of the building. So I am doing pretty much the same thing and just cutting away the top layer of paperboard. I painted those in a very similar way to the concrete. Give me a good ride. I need a way we can dream of. And just stuck them on the outside. As always, I'm going in and filling some of the cracks between where I'm sticking the paperboard together and just trying to make it really nice and clean. I also started to work on the windows of the top roof area, and before I did that, I needed to paint the red color of the top roof. I also painted that part of the roof area on the bottom layer so that it would look dark on the inside. Now this is kind of a Tudor style building, so there are a lot of areas with different wood details. So to create those, I'm again using paperboard in a very similar method that I did in Howl's bedroom with the flooring. So I'm going in with a relatively blunt but pointy object, which in this case is a yarn needle, and creating some indentations on the paperboard that look a little bit like wood grain. Then I'm going in and using some different shades and variations to paint all of those pieces to hopefully make them look as much like wood as possible. I'm using a makeup brush for this as well to really get that dry, streaky wood grain texture. Also, I went in and painted these with Mod Podge. I don't really know that they are sealed wood beams, but parts of them really do look quite reflective. Then I started creating the staircase, which is probably one of the more complicated shapes that we have going on here. I'm just cutting out the two sides from paperboard to be the steps and gluing it all together, creating strips to be the backs of the stairs and just gluing them all the way up the staircase. The tops of the stairs do have a certain width to them, so of course we're again going in with our craft foam. I'm cutting some strips of that a little bit larger than needed so that there's going to be some overhang, and then laying that on top of our stair bases. I attached the stairs onto the facade of the building and then just patched up that seam in between where the paperboard and the top foam of the stairs meet. And then I painted all of that to match similarly to the concrete base. I painted the inside of the alcoves where the windows go, and then we had to work on the railing. I'm making the railing out of quite a variety of different pieces. Were these things the best choice to make this out of? Maybe not.
Exciting.
I'm starting out with a relatively thin wire, and then I'm cutting a thin piece of a popsicle stick to be the straight slats of the railing. There are also in between some curly, more decorative pieces, and I'm creating those by using yarn. I just coated the yarn with glue and then swirled them into the shape that I wanted them to be and let it dry in that shape. After those dried, I painted everything black so it will all match, and then we just have to assemble everything later. To create the windows and doors, I needed to cut out the more complicated shapes of where the windows are going to be. So the tops of them all have kind of a sun ray pattern, I guess, that I'm cutting out. The main doors also have some window areas. Then I need to start building up some of the frame and border areas using pieces of craft foam. I also went in with some yarn, laying it around some of the window areas to make a thinner border. Since the top of a lot of these pieces are an arch, Yarn makes it a lot easier to create those frames because it's flexible. The door has quite a lot of different details on it, so I'm just going in with some puffy paint to create parts of those florally sort of detail pieces. Then we need to paint the frames, of course, before we put any windows in. We're painting the frames to look like wood to match a lot of the other elements in this piece. Then I laid on some plastic food container packaging, you all know by now, on the back of those. Afterwards, I went in to paint the really small details on the door, so floral motifs and things like that along the sides and above the door. I also needed to create the decals on the windows. I really just did my best here. It's not gonna be one of those sign painting videos where they just do it perfectly in about 10 seconds. I just tried to do it as neatly as I could. In order to help me with that, I did draw where the letters would need to be placed on a piece of paperboard and just taped it on the back so that I would have a guide when I painted it on the actual plastic. Painting Hatter with yellow first and then going over top of that with gold. Attach the plastic onto the door, and then we had to do the same thing on the door windows, except much smaller, which I'm not gonna lie, made it a lot harder.
This isn't gonna be easy.
I just did my best again. Then I needed to make the door handles that stretch from one side of the door to the other. So I'm using a copper piece of wire, and naturally that means that I'm here using my arch nemesis super glue to put those on, so hopefully they will stay. And did it get on my fingers? Of course it did.
Uh-oh.
Then I also, of course, have to make the little curtains that are going across the top windows of the door. I'm using white tissue paper to make these and just folding it up accordion style to make it look as much like a curtain as I could and gluing it on the back of those windows. Then I had to assemble and finish up that top roof piece. I started putting on some of the wood trim pieces at the top, and then I realized I actually should probably do the weathering for that red area first. So I took it off and started doing that instead. We don't always get things in the right order here.
Wow, you're good.
Are you nuts?
So I just painted on a lighter pinkish color to a lot of the corners. Then I glued on all of the wood trim pieces. The rest of my life, I wish I could turn back time. Ooh. Then I used some really thin pieces of craft foam to create the little ledges underneath the windows. I painted them before I glued them on, so I wouldn't have to deal with all of that tomfoolery, I suppose. To create the bars on the inside of those windows, I'm using a twist tie, cutting pieces of it to the right length and sticking them in there.
Could you use some help?
I'll be fine.
To create the wooden beams that are sticking out and I guess supporting the top roof part, I'm doing this in honestly a very tedious way. There were probably a lot better ways to do it, but it was the materials that I had laying around. So I'm taking 2 pieces of cardboard, gluing them together for each one, covering all of the sides of that except for the back and the top with paperboard. Then, as with all of the other things that I painted like wood in this project, I'm doing it the same way. What a surprise. I also sealed those with some Mod Podge as well, like all the other pieces. Then we have to start on some of these smaller, fun details. I started by creating the little certificate kind of thing that is on the side of the shop right next to the door. I'm cutting that out from paperboard and also creating a frame. Then I'm using some of my tea-dyed paper scraps to create the Hatter's certificate on the inside. I painted the frame gold and just laid that on over top. Then I started making the lanterns on either side of the door. These were probably one of the hardest things to make, especially at that scale.
Looks like I've got my work cut out for me.
So don't expect these to be wonderful. So naturally I'm cutting out all sides of each of them from paperboard and then trying to assemble it into a 3D shape that way. The difficult part of these were that the frame is relatively thin, which is pretty difficult to make at that scale and have it stay together. I painted the outside frames black and then added white paper in the little window areas where the lantern light would come through. I attached that onto some small back pieces that will attach to the wall and added some yarn to give it a little bit more dimension. I painted all of that to make it match and added a little drop of puppy paint on the very top. And then we get to make one of the most fun pieces, the sign for the hat shop. This is something that I was looking forward to making since the very beginning. The sign is hanging from this sort of swirly metal wrought iron looking piece. I cut the frame of that out from paperboard, and then we have some swirly decorative pieces, again, much like the stair railing. I am also using yarn to make those again. I cut out the hat part of the sign and the little banner underneath where the actual name will go. And then we just had to paint everything black first, and then I added some of the details onto the hat to make it actually look more like a hat. And then we're here again, pretending we could ever be sign painters and just painting on hatters in the font like it is in the movie. I'm going in with yellow first in all of these details and then going over them in gold. To attach everything together, I'm using yarn again. I just painted a little bit of it black and attached those and then glued all of the hanging pieces so that it is all part of one piece. Now this may come as a surprise, but there are hats in the hat shop windows. We have a really small amount of space on the inside to actually put these, so I'm just painting them in 2 dimensions on paperboard. I tried to make them look like the ones in the windows as best as I could, but honestly, in every different shot, there's kind of different hats and they're all slightly different colors, so then I just had to cut them out and attach them onto some really thin pieces of paperboard that I painted gold, which I actually had from Howl's bedroom. So they are acting as the stands for the hats on display, gluing those onto the back so they can be in the window at different heights. And then it's time to assemble. And then our hat shop was complete. So here is Sophie's hat shop. So
Do you like
it
it?
was really nice to just be able to kind of do a part 2 of a project and finish it off. I am going to be showing some of the behind the scenes of how I shoot my miniatures because it is just my favorite part of the process. Blackmagic did very kindly send me the Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro that I am now using on my videos. Since the beginning of my filmmaking career, I have been the biggest proponent of the camera does not make the shots. Cameras are really great in that they can provide you with additional tools to create the image that you're trying to make, but truly you can make something amazing on almost any camera, especially nowadays. That being said, since I got the new camera, I have started recording all of my final sequences in 4K, which I've wanted to do for so long because it really opens up a lot of options for me in editing. It makes creating what I want my vision to be so much easier. So for the hat shop, I decided that I wanted to do a day version and a night version, which is something that I do in a lot of my projects. As a general rule, I try to film my miniatures in several different lighting situations or locations. I would definitely say that here on this channel, we're in the deep end of budget filmmaking. Most of my lighting is done with normal lamps or flashlights or lighting that I have made myself. The lighting setup for this one was pretty simple. I wanted to make the lighting like the daytime scenes of the film, so with sunlight coming from above and to the side. This is one of the few shots that I've done that I only lit with one light. I got a really cheap ring light for Christmas, so I'm using that to mimic the sun because it has a very wide spread and it's pretty soft. As always, it's just propped up on top of my sewing machine so that I could get the height. It's just the crafting version of a bunch of stacked books. The night part of the scene is pretty much the same, except I have some blue lighting gels over the light to mimic moonlight. And I did also use a flashlight to create the light on the front of the shop that would be coming from the 2 lanterns that I plan to add in later. So most of the magic for this project happens in editing.
Did you use your magic to make this?
Only a little.
For this one, my color correction was really simple. I just kind of brightened up the colors a little bit and tried to match everything relatively well to the background that I was using. But mostly I shot for how I wanted it to look. I wanted to key out the background and put in some clouds during the day and stars at night. I think it really gives it this kind of fantastic, surreal look that reminded me a little bit of the art style in Ghibli films. Maybe it only reminded me of that, but I keyed out the background and put in the clouds. I chose these ones because I felt like the colors went really well with the rest of the piece, and it matched the lighting relatively well. It came from the same direction and everything. The stars are just a little bit different. Another thing that I really commonly do in a lot of my projects is that I will overlay some kind of stars or texture on top of some existing video. So technically compositing, but it's just really simple compositing. I'm just masking out everything that is not the sky part so that the stars will only be on that area. And this is when shooting in 4K really comes in handy. It's easiest to make these edits on a still frame and then create the camera movement digitally. And then I have the extra resolution to play with so we're not losing any quality. Those are just a couple of the pieces of the process. I will have more over on Patreon. As always, the biggest thank you to everyone over on Patreon and Coffee for helping to support the channel because you all really keep it going. I say this every time, but I am just so unbelievably grateful. Yokopalu sent me their version of Sophie's room from the hat shop. I love seeing all projects from the community. They just make me so happy, and honestly, they motivate me so much in my own work as well.
So long.